You will be my wife in name only." Garrett's iron whisper was the coldest thing Madeline had ever heard. A contract written in ice just moments before the world outside erupted in gunfire. She hadn't just accepted a loveless bargain. She was now trapped in a bullet-riddled carriage with the man who vowed never to touch her, watching his own men betray him. He was bleeding out, and she, the silent, decorative bride, was the only thing standing between his death and the political enemies hunting him. But the terrifying secret she discovered while saving his life changed the rules of the entire game. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The Hall of Vows at Garrett Winslow's remote mountain estate was a study in cold, magnificent power. Dark, carved wood and stone reinforced the image of an ancient fortress, starkly contrasted by the vibrant, severe blue of the mountain peaks visible through the tall, arched windows. Madeline Corwin, 26, stood alone, her striking red wedding gown a defiant splash of warmth in the rigid space. The dress, with its ornate lace and pearl cascades, like the image, was a perfect product of society, yet its color whispered of the passionate nature she had been taught to restrain. She adjusted the heavy pearl necklace at her throat, her movement betraying no tension, but her sharp, observant eyes took in every detail of the room. She was poised, fulfilling her role as the dutiful daughter and the necessary wife. She watched Garrett Winslow approach, a formidable, iron-willed man whose face was a carefully constructed mask of stoic honor. He paused just a foot away, the very air around him feeling charged with distrust and resolve. The words came, quiet and devoid of feeling, ripping through the tense silence like a knife. "You will be my wife in name only, Madeline." Garrett's voice was an iron whisper. "Do not mistake this contract for affection. I need a wife to secure my position, not a partner. I have none left to give." Madeline met his icy, guarded stare. She had been raised to know duty, but the coldness was a physical blow. A single, agonizing thought echoed in the silence of her mind. "I accepted the terms, but he has no idea what he is turning away." This transaction defined her duty, but she knew the heart hidden beneath the red silk was more courageous and fiercely loyal than his iron will could ever anticipate. The ceremony was a blur of hollow words and rigid postures. Madeline signed her name beside Garrett's on the marriage contract, the ink drying on the page before the warmth of any sentiment could reach it. When it was done, Garrett offered his arm with the stiff precision of a soldier performing a drill, rather than a husband claiming his bride. She took it, her gloved fingers resting lightly on his sleeve, and together they descended the stone steps of the Hall of Vows toward the waiting carriage. The mountain air bit at her cheeks as they emerged, sharp and unforgiving, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. A convoy of 4 riders flanked the ornate black carriage, their horses stamping impatiently against the frozen ground. Madeline noted each man's position, their weapons, the way they held themselves in their saddles. It was a habit born from years of quiet observation, of watching and listening while others assumed she was merely decorative. Garrett handed her into the carriage without a word, his grip firm but impersonal, as though he were loading cargo rather than escorting a wife. The door closed between them and the outside world, sealing them into an intimate space that felt anything but. He settled into the seat across from her, his broad frame taking up more than its share of the velvet bench, his gaze fixed firmly on the frosted window. The carriage lurched forward, and the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Madeline smoothed the crimson silk of her gown over her knees, using the motion to steady herself. She would not be the first to break. She had agreed to this arrangement with her eyes open, knowing the terms, understanding the weight of her family's debt to the Winslow name. Her father's gambling had brought them to the edge of ruin, and Garrett Winslow's need for a respectable wife to secure a crucial political alliance had offered them a lifeline. A transaction. Nothing more. And yet, sitting across from the man who had just sworn before witnesses to honor and protect her, Madeline felt the cold seep deeper than the mountain air could account for. She studied him through lowered lashes. His jaw was set like granite, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved by a sculptor with no patience for softness. He was handsome in a severe, uncompromising way, the kind of man who commanded rooms without raising his voice. But there was something else beneath that iron composure, something she had glimpsed in the brief flicker of his eyes when he had spoken his vow. Pain. Old, carefully buried, and utterly unhealed. The carriage rocked as they wound down the mountain pass, the road narrowing as it descended into a dense corridor of towering pines. Madeline turned her attention to the window, watching the escort riders through the frost-kissed glass. 3 ahead, 1 behind. She frowned, counting again. When they had departed the estate, there had been 4 riders flanking the carriage, 2 on each side. Now the formation had shifted. 3 rode ahead in a tight cluster, while a single rider lagged behind. His horse maintaining a distance that felt deliberate rather than strategic. Madeline's fingers tightened imperceptibly on her gloves. She knew the principles of protective escorts. Her uncle had served in the cavalry before his death, and he had taught her, during long afternoons when her mother thought she was embroidering, about formations, vulnerabilities, and the subtle signs of a plan gone wrong. A proper escort maintained balanced coverage, especially on a narrow mountain road where the terrain itself became a weapon. This formation left their flanks exposed. She glanced at Garrett, but his eyes remained fixed on the window, his expression offering nothing. Did he not see it? Or did he simply not care to share his observations with a wife who was merely a contractual necessity? The rider at the rear adjusted his position again, falling back another few lengths. Madeline watched him exchange a look with one of the men ahead, a quick, furtive glance that lasted barely a heartbeat. Her pulse quickened, though she kept her breathing steady. Something was wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated. Garrett had made the terms of their arrangement painfully clear. He did not want a partner. He did not want her counsel or her concern. He wanted a silent, compliant wife who would fulfill her role and ask nothing of him in return. But the prickling at the back of her neck would not be ignored. "Your escort formation has changed," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Garrett's gaze snapped to her, sharp and assessing. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, surprise perhaps, or the faintest stirring of interest. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask. "You concern yourself with military matters, Mrs. Winslow." The title felt strange on his lips, cold and formal, yet it sent an unexpected tremor through her chest. "I concern myself with survival, Mr. Winslow," she replied evenly. "The rear guard has fallen back twice in the last quarter mile. Your flanks are exposed, and the lead riders are clustered too tightly for effective response. Either your men are incompetent, or this formation is intentional." Garrett held her gaze for a long, weighted moment. Then, without a word, he reached beneath his coat and withdrew a polished revolver, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. "It seems," he said, his voice low and edged with something that might have been grim appreciation, "that my wife is more observant than I anticipated." Before Madeline could respond, the first gunshot shattered the mountain silence. "That is a fantastic high-tension opening. You've perfectly set up the cold contract. Madeline's keen observation skills, and the immediate eruption of the inciting incident. The gunshot was immediately followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground outside. Garrett didn't hesitate. He kicked open the opposite carriage door, leveraging his broad shoulder against the frame, and dove out onto the narrow dirt track in a single fluid motion. "Stay down!" he barked over the sudden crescendo of gunfire. Madeline didn't stay down. She pressed her face against the velvet bench and watched through the thin gap beneath the window frame. The carriage was now the center of a chaotic, brutal ambush. Two men, clearly not part of the original escort, had materialized from the dense pine line, firing toward the front riders, who were already falling into disarray. She saw Garrett, already reloading, using the carriage wheel as cover. He fired twice, the sound deafening and concussive even inside the cabin. One of the lead assailants crumpled, but the original escort, the men Madeline had observed, were also turning their weapons. The rider who had fallen back was now firing directly at Garrett's position. It wasn't an attack by enemies. It was a betrayal. A second, more powerful gunshot exploded near the horses, followed by a sharp crack and a terrifying lurch. An oil lamp inside the carriage shuddered and fell, plunging the interior into shadow. The horses, panicked and wounded, began to drag the carriage wildly toward the precipitous edge of the pass. "Garrett!" Madeline screamed, scrambling toward the door he had left ajar. He spun toward her, firing over his shoulder, but he was too slow. A blinding flash and a searing pain bloomed across his side. He staggered back against the carriage, his breathing ragged before collapsing heavily on the track. Madeline didn't think about the red silk of her gown, or the dignity she was supposed to maintain. She scrambled out the door, ignoring the bullets whizzing past her head. The horses were dragging them toward a ravine. They would all be killed if the carriage went over. She reached Garrett. His face pale and slick with blood, oozing rapidly from a deep, ragged wound near his ribs. His hand, still clutching the revolver, was slick with it. He was conscious, but barely. "The reins!" he managed to choke out. Madeline nodded, already acting. She knew she couldn't outfight the ambushers, who were focused on confirming Garrett's death. She only had seconds to get them both to safety. She gripped the handle of the carriage door, hauling herself up until she could reach the driver's box. The reins were whipping uselessly. She had to cut the horses loose and then find cover. Wait. Her mind flashed back to their descent. Roughly a mile back, she had seen it. A barely visible track leading off the main road, marked only by a dilapidated moss-covered stone archway. It led nowhere important, but it was secluded. In a frantic and desperate blur, Madeline grabbed the discarded reins, managing to saw through the leather with the small, razor-sharp letter opener she kept pinned inside her skirt, a silent nod to her rebellious spirit. The horses bolted free, dragging the now lightened remains of the harness and carrying the ambushers' attention with them. Silence descended, punctuated only by her own gasping breaths. The attackers assumed the carriage and its contents were gone, having plunged into the ravine. She knelt by Garrett, his massive body heavy and limp. The betrayal meant no one else was coming to help. "We move," she whispered, tearing off her satin wedding scarf, the one item she hadn't needed for the transaction. It was wide, clean, and strong. She pressed it tightly over his wound, using the fine lace trim to quickly knot it, providing immediate pressure. "The cabin," she muttered, remembering the stone archway. "I saw a path. We'll be exposed here." Garrett, barely able to speak, his eyes glazed with shock, offered a single, slurred word. "How?" "My uncle taught me observation," she hissed, hauling his arm over her shoulder. "Your life is now a matter of survival, Mr. Winslow, and I accepted the terms." With superhuman effort born of adrenaline and sheer necessity, Madeline half-dragged, half-carried the iron-willed man off the road, moving toward the barely visible stone archway and the dense, protective shadows of the mountain. The abandoned cabin was less a sanctuary and more a decaying shelter carved into the side of the mountain. It smelled of damp earth and disuse, but the thick log walls offered protection from the wind and, more critically, from view. After an agonizing, halting crawl of half a mile, Madeline finally managed to drag Garrett inside, settling him onto a meager, dusty cot against the far wall. The adrenaline that had powered her through the ambush was fading, replaced by a cold, shaking exhaustion. Her expensive red silk gown was now stained with dirt and Garrett's blood, the delicate lace ripped. But she ignored the ruined fabric and focused entirely on the wounded man. Garrett was fighting the pain with a grim, guttural silence, his face pale beneath a film of sweat. The makeshift bandage she had applied earlier was soaked through. "I need light," Madeline murmured. She found a stub of candle and a box of old, damp matches tucked onto a narrow shelf. The small, flickering flame did little to dispel the cabin's oppressive darkness, but it was enough to work by. First, she needed to properly clean and bind the wound. She tore the remaining clean sections from the hem of her petticoat, the fine linen would serve, and found a rusty tin canteen half full of surprisingly clear water near the cold hearth. "This will hurt, Garrett," she warned, though she didn't wait for a response. She cut away the fabric around his injury, a deep, jagged furrow across his ribs, and began the brutal process of cleaning it. He cried out once, a raw sound of agony, and his hand shot out, clamping around her wrist with punishing strength. "Don't touch me," he gasped, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Lying bitch!" Madeline didn't flinch. She kept her grip steady and her expression calm, refusing to allow his pain or his hostility to break her concentration. "I am cleaning the wound, Mr. Winslow," she stated, her tone flat and professional. "The alternative is blood poisoning. Choose your complaint carefully." His grip loosened infinitesimally, the pain overriding the delirium. He released her, slumping back against the wall, eyes closed, breathing shallow and fast. Madeline worked with quiet, meticulous precision. She lacked sophisticated tools, but she applied pressure, flushed the wound with water, and with steady hands, fashioned a tight, clean compress. Her knowledge wasn't from a textbook. It came from tending to stable hands, injured servants, and her own small childhood scrapes, situations where relying on a doctor was impossible or frowned upon. When she finished, she found a scratchy wool blanket and covered him, then sat back on the dirt floor, utterly depleted. Hours bled into early morning. The candle burned low and a fever began to take hold of Garrett. He tossed and turned, mumbling incoherently. Madeline forced a few sips of water into him, desperate to cool his raging temperature. In his delirium, the fortress of his control began to crack and crumble. The words that had been locked behind his iron will now tumbled out, fragmented and filled with bitter resentment. "The accounts. The ledger. You promised me, Elizabeth," he groaned, his voice cracking with lingering pain and deeper betrayal. "You swore. You used the funds. Left me exposed to the council. For that snake." Madeline leaned closer, her sharp ears catching the disjointed pieces of his past. He wasn't talking to her. He was reliving the moment that had created the cold, distrustful man she had married. He shifted violently, gripping the air as if reaching for a phantom contract. "I built that fortress for you. The trust, the reputation, all of it. And you sold it for a handful of silver and a petty title." He laughed then, a harsh, painful sound that held no humor. "Wife in name only. That's all I'll ever offer again. Never, never again will I trust a woman who seeks my name without honoring my integrity." Madeline felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The pain she had glimpsed behind his eyes was not just professional betrayal, it was profound, personal heartbreak. A woman named Elizabeth, had used the cover of his love and trust to undermine his financial empire, leaving him politically and financially vulnerable. He needs a wife to secure his position. That was the contract he had offered her. He hadn't sought her for love, but for political necessity, determined to never give any woman the power to break his heart or ruin his name again. Her red dress, the symbol of her own stifled passion, now felt like a cruel irony against his backdrop of irreparable emotional damage. Madeline rose and found the last of the clean water. She dipped the hem of her ruined gown into it and began to gently bathe Garrett's forehead, trying to bring down the fever. He quieted under her touch, mistaking the gentle, cool relief for the phantom woman from his past. "Alice," he whispered, his voice heartbreakingly young and vulnerable. "You stayed. You didn't run." Madeline froze, her heart catching in her throat at the name that wasn't hers. He didn't even know her name in this state. He saw only a familiar, comforting presence that hadn't abandoned him. "I didn't run," Madeline confirmed softly, allowing him the delusion. "I will stay." Her loyalty, the flaw that made her love even those who hurt her, was now fully engaged. She wasn't just tending to her contractual husband. She was tending to a deeply wounded man who had been betrayed by the one thing she valued above all else: integrity. And in the cold, dark cabin, with his life hanging in the balance, Madeline Corwin knew her role had shifted entirely. This was no longer just about duty. This was about saving the man who refused to be saved. Days blurred into a week within the confines of the dusty cabin. The mountain outside became a silent witness to their slow, desperate struggle for survival. The first 3 days were the worst, a grueling cycle of fever spikes, wound dressing, and Garrett's fragmented, painful confessions. Madeline slept only in short, snatched intervals, always close enough to feel the warmth of his fever against the mountain chill. She rationed the few emergency provisions found in the carriage debris. A small bottle of spirits, some dried biscuits, but primarily sustained herself on sheer necessity, using her time awake to forage for dry firewood and clean snow for water, moving with the practiced stealth of a predator avoiding detection. As the fever finally broke on the 4th day, the delirium receded, but the vulnerability it left behind was almost harder for Garrett to face. He regained full consciousness to find himself entirely dependent on the wife he had coldly dismissed as a transactional necessity. His own men had betrayed him. The woman he had sworn to keep at a distance was the only reason he was alive. When he opened his eyes, clear and sharp for the first time, he found Madeline sitting near the hearth, carefully mending a tear in his coat, the very one that had been shot through. She was still in the ruined red gown, but she had expertly pinned up the skirt to allow freedom of movement, transforming the opulent garment into something practical and defiant. The heavy pearls around her neck now seemed incongruous, a misplaced relic of the life they had both fled. The silence between them was no longer tense, but weighted with unsaid truths. "The wound," Garrett rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "It has not festered," Madeline replied, not looking up, her focus absolute on the needle. "You'll survive this, Mr. Winslow, though your pride may require a longer recovery." The faint, unexpected sharpness of her wit pierced his habitual stoicism. He was used to flattery or fear, not dry assessment. "You saved my life," he stated, his voice regaining its familiar commanding timbre, though softened by exhaustion. Madeline finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes, usually calm, held a depth of resilience he found unnerving. That was a matter of self-preservation, as the alternative meant being dragged into a ravine. I accepted the contract, and being shot on my wedding day was not part of the agreed-upon terms. Her refusal to accept his gratitude as anything other than a simple statement of fact disarmed him more effectively than any show of emotion could have. She didn't seek his admiration. She merely stated her value. Over the next few days, he began to study her with the same intensity she had studied him. He watched her measure out the dwindling supply of spirits to sterilize the dressing, her hands moving with an unexpected strength and steadiness. He observed her movements in the dim light, precise, economical, and silent. He realized the quietness he had mistaken for aristocratic shyness was actually profound observation and control. One afternoon, he tried to move without assistance and failed, his face going pale with pain. "Foolish," Madeline said instantly at his side. She pushed him back down with surprising force, her hand firm on his chest. "If you rupture the stitches, you will have wasted 3 days of my time. You may command estates, but for now, you command nothing but the breath in your lungs." He looked up at her, catching the fierce, unyielding look in her eye, the same focus she'd had when she was driving them through the brush. This wasn't a girl. This was a woman forged in a different kind of fire. He realized the rebellious spirit mentioned in her description was not melodrama, but genuine courage. He needed water, and he asked for it, his voice low. She didn't offer sympathy or question his sudden need. She simply brought the cup. He found himself relying on her entirely, not just for physical care, but for the stark, honest reporting of their situation. "The men who betrayed me," Garrett said one evening, the firelight licking shadows across his face. "The one at the rear, you saw him communicate with the front." "A quick glance, Mr. Winslow," she confirmed. "Subtle enough to be missed if one was not expecting it. It signaled the completion of the shift, meaning they were ready for the ambush to commence." "You saw it," he repeated, almost to himself. The realization hit him. His distrust, his need for control, had made him blind to the very threat she had instantly recognized. He had judged her by her lace and her title, dismissing her for the appearance of fragility, while she possessed the sharpest survival instincts he had ever encountered. "Your ability to observe the enemy is flawless," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Madeline accepted the compliment without visible vanity, her eyes resting on the mountains outside. "I was raised to be decorative, Mr. Winslow, but I was not raised to be stupid. I simply listened when others thought I was silent." The walls around his heart did not shatter, but they began to yield. The emotional damage inflicted by Elizabeth had left him dependent on rigid honor, but Madeline's quiet strength was forcing him to acknowledge a different kind of honor, the courage that lay beneath the most refined exterior. He might have claimed her as a wife in name only, but in the desolate quiet of the cabin, he had discovered that Madeline Corwin was far more valuable than any political alliance. She was his protector, his shield, and perhaps the unexpected anchor his shattered life desperately needed. The week had passed a critical threshold. Garrett, though still weak and confined to the cot, was healing steadily. The dull glaze of pain had been replaced by the focused intensity that Madeline now recognized as his true nature. They existed in an odd, suspended reality, married, isolated, and entirely dependent on each other, with the external world reduced to a threat lurking just beyond the thick log walls. He had watched her throughout the morning as she moved around the small space, conserving their remaining provisions. Her silence, once an extension of her reserved demeanor, now felt like an invitation to truth, an acknowledgement that the superficial barriers of their contract were meaningless in the face of near death. "The ambush," Garrett began, his voice low and devoid of inflection, yet demanding her full attention. It was not a random attack by bandits. It was precise. You observed the failure in the escort. I missed it because I was too focused on the political structure surrounding me, on the betrayal I had already anticipated from others. Madeline stopped what she was doing and sat on the stool opposite him, resting her hands in her lap. She waited, offering him the dignity of telling his story without prompting. He paused, collecting his thoughts, visibly bracing himself to speak of his weakness. The woman I mentioned in my fever, Elizabeth. She was not a lover in the frivolous sense. She was a confidant, someone I trusted with the full oversight of my financial interests and my most critical political alliances. She used that trust. She diverted funds meant for a crucial land deal, exposing me to a competing interest and leaving me vulnerable to a government council whose support I desperately needed. Garrett ran a hand over his jaw, his eyes darkening with remembered rage and humiliation. I needed a wife, a respectable, unimpeachable woman who could instantly restore the appearance of stability and secure the necessary political backing for the final vote on that land deal. My reputation was intact, but my solvency was not. The marriage was a shield, Madeline. I needed your family's name and lack of scandal to cement the alliance before the truth about the missing funds became public. He looked at her then, his gaze heavy and assessing. I owed you the truth of my vulnerability. You saved my life, and you deserve to know what you are risking it for. Madeline listened without interrupting, the information clicking into place with the fragments she had heard during his fever. His coldness, his declaration that the marriage was in name only, had not been born of indifference, but of defensive necessity. A desperate attempt to protect his damaged heart from further manipulation. When he finished, the silence returned, no longer charged with hostility, but with mutual confession. Madeline took a deep breath, her own confession feeling insignificant yet essential. My father gambled away his and my mother's inheritance, and then began leveraging assets he did not fully own. She began, her voice steady. The debt he accumulated to a certain Mr. Graves was considerable. When Mr. Graves came to collect, my father faced immediate ruin and scandal that would have completely destroyed the Corwin name. She met Garrett's gaze, her expression honest. Your proposition came through your solicitor just as Mr. Graves was preparing to seize the last of our holdings. The dowry was substantial, but more importantly, the alliance with the Winslow name deterred Mr. Graves. We didn't choose your wealth, Mr. Winslow. We chose your name as a shield. The money was a lifeline, but the prestige was the weapon that saved us from ruin. Madeline smoothed the crimson skirt of her ruined gown. I accepted the contract because it was my duty and because my family had exhausted every other possibility. I understood it was a transaction, but I did not understand the depth of the betrayal that necessitated it. Garrett looked at her, not with the cold calculation of a man assessing a property, but with a new, dawning recognition. They were both victims of ambitious manipulation, forced into a contractual marriage to shield themselves from external threats. So, Garrett said, a hint of something grimly ironic in his tone. My wife is not merely decorative. She is resourceful, observant, and married me not for love of my fortune, but out of necessity driven by her father's folly. And my husband is not merely iron-willed. He is betrayed, financially exposed, and married me not for love of my prestige, but out of necessity driven by a trusted confidant's malice. Madeline counted evenly. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Garrett's mouth. It was the first genuine expression she had seen on his face. The terms have changed, Mrs. Winslow, he finally admitted. This is no longer a contract. It is a siege. And we are partners in survival. The fortress in his eyes had not vanished, but he had lowered the drawbridge just enough to allow her inside. Their marriage, born of two separate debts, was now redefined by a shared truth and a mutual threat, shifting from a one-sided duty to a powerful, unspoken pact. The small cabin had settled into a strained routine, a rhythm dictated by the demands of a healing wound and dwindling resources. Garrett was strong enough now to sit upright for hours at a time, his eyes no longer glazed with fever, but sharp with the restless energy of a man accustomed to constant control. He was an intimidating presence even when confined, his vast frame seeming to absorb all the available space and air. Madeline found herself continually navigating the physical challenge of existing in close proximity to him, yet she did so without comment or apology. They spoke only of logistics, the weather, the need for more wood, the frequency of the dressing changes. Yet, beneath the sterile exchanges, something was growing. Garrett had begun leaving decisions entirely to her. When to start the fire, how to stretch the remaining dried meat, where to place the watch, a silent surrender of authority that acknowledged her superior observation skills and resourcefulness. One afternoon, Madeline was attempting to hammer a protruding nail back into the wall using a smooth, heavy river stone. It was clumsy, tedious work, and the repeated thud, thud, thud was frustratingly ineffective. Garrett watched her, a low, frustrated sound rumbling in his chest. "If you angle the stone just so, Mrs. Winslow, you will strike the head cleanly. Do you intend to chip away the mountain or simply secure the timber?" Madeline stopped, dropping the stone with a soft clink. She turned to him, her expression serious. "My apologies, Mr. Winslow. It is difficult to perform certain manual tasks with the level of quiet efficiency expected of a decorative wife. Perhaps, if you could move from your position, which currently occupies 90% of the structural integrity of this cabin, I might achieve a better angle." It was a statement delivered with her characteristic deadpan precision. She wasn't being flirtatious. She was simply being honest about his imposition. Garrett stared at her, and then slowly, a flicker began in his eyes. It was a rusty, unused sound, a breath drawn deep and rough, before it emerged as a genuine booming laugh. It wasn't a charming laugh. It was a deep, gravelly sound of sudden, painful amusement that felt utterly foreign to the man who had only offered her cold iron and silence. The sudden, vigorous movement was a mistake. A sharp, searing spasm of pain shot through his bandaged ribs, cutting the laugh short with a ragged gasp. He clenched his jaw, eyes instantly shuttering in a reflexive effort to suppress the agony, his large body tensing against the cot. Madeline was across the room instantly, her movement fluid and instantaneous. She didn't ask if he was all right. She acted. Her hand shot out, not to his face or his hand, but firmly and deliberately to the muscular contour of his bicep, simultaneously pressing her other hand against the bandage at his ribs, steadying him, confirming the integrity of the compress. "Still commanding only the breath in your lungs, I see," she murmured, her voice stripped of all wit, concerned only with the medical necessity of stabilization. Garrett felt the warmth of her fingers through the thick linen of his shirt, and a shock ran through him that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. Her touch was firm, purposeful, and entirely free of expectation. It wasn't a feminine caress, but a physician's grip, a touch meant to heal and anchor. He had spent years, since Elizabeth's betrayal, training himself to recoil from any touch that sought to cross the line from formality to intimacy. He remembered the calculated softness of Elizabeth's hand, always leading to a request, a demand, or a lie. Madeline's grip was raw, honest contact, tethering him to the present, vital reality of the cabin. He found he couldn't move, not from pain, but from an overwhelming, terrifying realization that he didn't want her hand to leave. Her quiet presence, her simple, unadorned strength, was the first thing that had ever truly made him feel safe. The deep, cold reservoir of mistrust he had maintained for years began to drain away, exposing a startling, fierce emotion he hadn't permitted himself to feel since boyhood: protection. It bloomed inside him, hot and overwhelming. He wanted to pull her closer, not in desire, but in a primal need to shield her from the world, from the elements, and from the enemies who were undoubtedly hunting them both. He wanted to claim her strength, not just for his recovery, but for his very soul. Garrett covered her hand on his bicep with his own, a massive, calloused palm engulfing her smaller, soft one. The silence in the cabin deepened, charged now with a new, dangerous awareness. "Don't pull away, Madeline," he commanded, his voice a low, rough plea that abandoned the formality of their contract entirely. He looked at her then, no longer seeing the necessary contractual wife, but the woman in the crimson dress who had risked death to haul his carcass off a mountain road. And for the first time, the man who had vowed eternal coldness felt his own heart crack, exposing a vulnerability far more painful and far more vital than any physical wound. The fragile new intimacy established between them felt like a sacred space, guarded by the thick log walls and the absolute isolation of the mountain. They were sitting in silence, discussing the risks of venturing out to hunt, when the sanctuary was violently invaded by sound, the distinct crunch of a horse's hooves on frozen earth, followed by a woman's clear, high-pitched voice calling out in affected concern. Garrett's entire body tensed, the sudden surge of protective fury overriding the pain in his side. He tried to rise, but Madeline's hand, instantly and firmly placed on his shoulder, pressed him back down. "Wait," she commanded, her voice a low warning. "If they found us this quickly, they are either part of the plot, or they tracked the original ambushers." The cabin door creaked open, admitting a blast of cold air and a figure that instantly seemed anachronistic against the rough wood and dirt floor. Eliza Branford stood framed in the doorway, impeccably dressed in riding habit of forest green velvet, her golden hair perfectly coiled, every line of her posture speaking of effortless city elegance. She looked as though she had simply stepped out of a drawing room, not navigated a treacherous mountain pass. "Garrett! Oh, thank the heavens!" Eliza cried, her voice shimmering with practiced emotion. She rushed past Madeline without so much as a glance, sinking dramatically onto the edge of the cot. When the report came of the ambush and the carriage, I was beside myself. We had no idea where you had gone. Did they hurt you badly, my dear?" Garrett allowed the superficial concern for a moment, his jaw tight. "I am recovering, Eliza. Your presence here is unexpected. Unnecessary," Madeline corrected, her voice quiet, but carrying the sharp, immediate finality of a closing door. She remained standing a few feet away, her arms crossed. The contrast between the two women stark and brutal. Eliza was the picture of conventional perfection. Madeline was a creature of necessity, still wearing the torn, blood-stained red gown of her unfortunate wedding day. Eliza finally acknowledged Madeline, casting a pitying, dismissive look over the ruined silk and the dirt smudge on Madeline's cheek. "Ah, Mrs. Winslow, I apologize. I was so overcome with concern for Garrett. It must have been simply dreadful for you, poor dear. These things are so very taxing on delicate nerves." Madeline held her gaze steady. "My nerves are quite adequate, Miss Branford," and I handled the dreadful situation perfectly well, as you can see." Eliza smiled sweetly, a look that failed to reach her ambitious eyes. "Of course, but you must understand, Garrett's world is complex. He deals with matters of state and financial pressures that require a very specific understanding of the players involved. When I heard about the ambush, I knew immediately it had to be related to the Tilden land acquisition, the one Elizabeth nearly ruined. I managed to use my connections to trace the funds that hired the gunmen. Those connections, my dear, are why I am here. We need to secure Garrett's position before the council meeting." She turned back to Garrett, laying a possessive hand on his chest, dangerously close to his injury. "I understand the full scope of your vulnerabilities, Garrett. Your wife, I'm sure, is excellent at pouring tea, but she is perhaps not best equipped to navigate the political fallout of a near assassination. It was the perfect, calculated blow, a skillful deployment of the very terms Garrett had used to define his marriage." She was subtly reminding him that Madeline was a mere vessel for legitimacy, whereas Eliza offered understanding and expertise in the cold, ruthless world of power he inhabited. Garrett's eyes flickered to Madeline, watching her reaction. She didn't appear hurt or defensive, only dangerously focused. "And what do you propose, Eliza?" Garrett asked, his tone flat, testing the depth of her ambition. Eliza leaned in conspiratorially. "We must get you out of this hovel. I brought a small team, my own men, trustworthy, and they can escort us back to my family's hunting lodge, which is far more secure. Your wife can be sent onto the main estate with a suitable chaperone. It would be best, Garrett, for the council to see us, you and I, working together publicly on your recovery and your reputation. You need someone who can speak to your peers with authority." She finished her proposal and cast a triumphant sidelong glance at Madeline, fully expecting the wife in name only to submit to the hierarchy. Madeline simply raised a cool, questioning eyebrow. "So, you are suggesting that the man who was nearly murdered by his own escort should now rely on your men, while I, who managed to save his life and secure his isolation, should be dismissed? That seems an unnecessary risk of competent assets, Miss Branford." Garrett watched the exchange, a slow, grim understanding dawning on his face. Eliza offered the comfort of the familiar, manipulative world he had almost died for. Madeline offered the terrifying, unpredictable strength of raw, genuine partnership. The choice was not between two women, but between the life he had rigidly enforced and the life she had courageously saved. Eliza, mistaking Madeline's calm assessment for weakness, smiled with condescending finality. "Safety is not about competency, Mrs. Winslow. It is about reputation. For Garrett's recovery, he needs the environment I can provide. And frankly, this arrangement, a contractual marriage, and you dressed like that, it raises questions. I am here to manage the narrative." She glanced pointedly at Garrett, her voice dropping to a seductive purr. "Come, Garrett, let me take you home. You and I understand the rules of the game." Garrett remained seated on the cot, his gaze fixed on the two women. The cabin suddenly felt suffocating, a crucible where his old, bitter identity was battling for survival against the fierce, exhilarating truth of the last week. Eliza represented the world he had built, a world of calculation, necessity, and inevitable betrayal. Madeline, in her ruined crimson dress, represented the life he had unexpectedly found, a life of honest loyalty, sharp intuition, and courage that asked nothing in return. He looked at Eliza, noting the calculating ambition in her eyes, a mirror of the malice that had motivated Elizabeth. Then he looked at Madeline, who stood with the quiet patience of a rock, waiting for the inevitable choice, refusing to plead her case. She did not need defending, she needed recognizing. The tension became a physical weight in the small room. Then, very slowly, Garrett began to move. He did not rush, but moved with a deliberate, rigid control that demanded attention. He pushed off the cot, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. He rose to his full, formidable height, steadying himself on the rough-hewn timber wall. He was still pale, still bearing the mark of betrayal, but his eyes were clear, and the mask of stoic honor had finally cracked to reveal the decisive man beneath. He did not walk toward Eliza. He walked toward Madeline. He paused directly in front of her, his gaze locking onto hers, a fierce, possessive claim that eclipsed the cold distance of their contracted marriage. Eliza. Garrett's voice was low, resonant, and absolute. You misunderstand the situation entirely. He reached out his large hand, brushing past the heavy pearls at Madeline's throat and settling firmly, protectively, on her shoulder. The touch was a definitive public gesture of ownership, of alliance. I do not need someone to manage the narrative, he continued, his eyes remaining fixed on Madeline as he addressed the rival. I need someone who understands the truth. I needed a wife in name only because I did not believe loyalty existed, Eliza. I believed all women were transactional. That was my vow. He looked away from Madeline for the first time, turning his icy glare fully upon Eliza. That vow is hereby null and void. The woman you see before you is the one who recognized the conspiracy when my own guard failed. She stopped the bleeding with the silk she was meant to wear for show. She drove us, wounded, to safety, and she has kept me alive for a week with nothing but her wits and her strength. He tightened his grip on Madeline's shoulder, pulling her an inch closer to his side, a clear, defiant display. You offer me political convenience and a managed reputation, Eliza. She offered me survival and a truth that broke through the walls I built to protect myself from treachery. His voice deepened, carrying the weight of a powerful declaration. My life was saved by her courage, and more importantly, my heart was saved by the unexpected loyalty I was too arrogant to believe in. He looked back down at Madeline, his gaze no longer cold or assessing, but raw with a fierce, protective recognition. I wanted a contract, Madeline. I found a partner, and from this day forward, you are my wife in every sense of the word, not for duty, but for choice. We face the council, the rivals, and the danger together. Are you with me? Madeline felt the weight of his claim, a fierce, passionate vow far exceeding the hollow words of their ceremony. She looked into the eyes of the man who had discarded his iron mask, seeing the vulnerable, true heart beating beneath. She reached up, placing her hand over his on her shoulder, confirming the pact. Always, Mr. Winslow, she replied, her own voice steady and equally absolute. I am yours. Eliza, pale and furious at being so thoroughly dismissed and relegated, realized she had lost the game. She had underestimated the silent, crimson-clad woman, and she knew her scheme had utterly failed. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the cabin, the heavy door slamming shut behind her, leaving them in the glorious, echoing silence of their new, true beginning. The journey down the mountain pass was slower, but infinitely surer than their ascent. They did not ride in the wrecked carriage, but on horseback, Garrett leaning heavily against the saddle, still weak but refusing to be carried. Madeline rode beside him, no longer simply an escort, but his shadow, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain, not with the anxiety of a survivor, but with the steady vigilance of a partner. Eliza and her untrustworthy retinue were long gone, having been dismissed with a cold finality that left no doubt about Garrett's absolute loyalty to the woman beside him. When they finally reached the Winslow estate, It was not the formal, imposing structure Madeline remembered from their wedding day, but a sanctuary she had helped defend. The servants, anticipating their master's death, stared openly at the sight. The formidable Garrett Winslow, pale and leaning heavily on his staff, accompanied by his wife, still clad in the crimson silk now scarred by mud and blood, but holding herself with a fierce, quiet dignity that demanded respect. There were no elaborate introductions or explanations. Madeline went directly to managing Garrett's continued recovery, ensuring the household was secured against further intrusion, and calmly dismantling the political damage Eliza was undoubtedly attempting to spread in the city. Garrett watched her, no longer with the cold assessment of a man who needed an ally, but with the profound gratitude of a man who had been found. Their life together began not with a shared bed or loving vows, but with a shared desk. Garrett, still too weak to receive visitors, dictated letters and strategies, and Madeline, the girl who was supposed to be merely decorative, took charge of his correspondence. She not only transcribed his intentions but anticipated them, offering insightful counterpoints and suggesting alliances that were keen and ruthlessly effective. He had sought a shield. He had gained a formidable strategist. One quiet evening, several weeks after their return, Garrett finally felt strong enough to walk the length of the grand drawing room. He found Madeline standing before a large covered canvas near the hearth. The wedding portrait, Garrett noted. It was delivered shortly after we departed. Yes, Madeline replied, her voice soft. I have not uncovered it. It was painted before the contract was broken, before we even knew each other. It is a lie, a representation of a marriage that never was. Garrett walked the remaining distance, stopping beside her. He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing the soft skin of her palm. The touch was no longer professional or anchoring. It was explicitly possessive and tender. Uncover it, he instructed. I want to see the lie that brought me the truth. Madeline lifted the velvet drape. The painting was magnificent. A formal, imposing portrait of a stern, unsmiling groom and a poised, beautiful bride in a striking red gown. It captured the cold contract perfectly. Yet, looking at the image now, Garrett no longer saw the transaction. He saw the fire beneath the composure, the courage hidden in the quiet eyes, and the defiant color of the dress that had symbolized the passion she had held in reserve. He turned away from the painted figures and looked at the woman beside him, whose hand he held. The red dress was long gone, replaced by a simple, practical gown, but the fierce loyalty in her eyes was more vivid than any silk. That man, Garrett said, touching his image in the portrait, vowed to keep his heart closed forever. He offered you a contract of distance. He was a fool. He drew her closer, his gaze intensely serious. I love you, Madeline. Not because you saved my life, but because you made me realize I had a heart left to save. I ask you to choose this marriage now, not for duty or for debt, but for genuine affection and shared purpose. Madeline's eyes shimmered. She had loved him deeply and loyally from the moment she first saw the genuine pain behind his stoicism, but hearing the declaration, the true unqualified vow, shattered the last of her reserve. I already chose you, Garrett, she whispered, resting her head against his chest, hearing the steady, strong beat of his heart, a heart that was now entirely her own. I chose survival, and I chose trust. Their marriage of convenience had ended on a mountain road. Their marriage of choice began here, in the quiet sincerity of their home, rewriting their future not on parchment and terms, but on respect, loyalty, and the boundless passion that her red dress had always promised. The portrait of the cold contract remained on the wall, a reminder of the lie they had overcome, but the reality of their union, built on shared secrets and survival, was infinitely stronger. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.